From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We've got to put things together, bring people together. And so my purpose in going will be to do just that, to be a positive influence on what's going on.
Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden heads to Kenosha, Wisconsin today to meet the family of Jacob Blake, the black man left paralyzed after an officer shot him 7 times at point-blank range in the back. Trump visited Tuesday, never said Blake's name. We'll get response from Congressmember Mark Pocan, who was born and raised in Kenosha, and whose family knew the family of Anthony Huber, one of 2 Black Lives Matter protesters killed by a white 17-year-old Trump-supporting vigilante. Then to Belarus, where mass protests continue to demand the resignation of President Alexander Lukashenko amidst a brutal government crackdown after what many say was a rigged election. Lukashenko shows no signs of backing down.
It will pass. These protests on the streets and statements that we are 500,000, a million? Listen, if there were 1 million of them, I wouldn't be talking to you now.
But first, after 23 deaths this year alone, the top commander at Fort Hood Army Base in Texas is removed. The Army's launched a new investigation into the murder of soldier Vanessa Guillen by a fellow soldier after she complained of sexual harassment. We'll speak with Air Force veteran Pam Campos-Palma, who leads the Vets for the People project. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has directed all 50 states and 5 large cities to make preparations to distribute a potential coronavirus vaccine as soon as late October. In a letter to the nation's governors, CDC Director Robert Redfield urged states to waive any requirements that would prevent vaccine distribution centers from becoming fully operational by November 1st. That's 2 days before Election Day. The government has hired the private company McKesson Corporation to distribute a vaccine once it's approved. There's growing concern the Trump administration might give emergency approval to a vaccine before clinical tests are completed in an attempt to boost the president's re-election chances. Public health officials have warned rushing an unproven vaccine could pose health dangers and inflame anti-vaccination sentiment. This all comes as the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 approaches 186,000. Meanwhile, COVID-19 cases are surging in the Midwest. More than 260 cases across 9 states have been linked to a recent motorcycle rally in Sturgis, South Dakota. 1 biker has already died. This comes as Iowa now has the highest COVID-19 rate per capita in the country. The number of new cases in Iowa soared by 90% over the past 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Iowa Senator Joni Ernst has become the latest Republican to embrace a conspiracy theory that far fewer people are dying from COVID-19. She also suggested doctors may be misclassifying COVID cases in order to make more money. President Trump's escalating his war on the World Health Organization. The State Department's announced it's redirecting $62 million owed to the WHO this year. In addition, the U.S. is withdrawing government employees who advise the organization. Trump's already announced the U.S. will leave the WHO, but that will not officially happen till next year. This all comes as the WHO is working with over 170 countries to develop a coronavirus vaccine, but the U.S. has refused to join or help fund the global effort. The U.S. has imposed sanctions on the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and another top ICC official. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the move Wednesday.
In June, the Trump administration authorized the imposition of economic sanctions against foreign persons directly engaged in ICC efforts to investigate U.S. or allied personnel and those who materially assisted in that effort. Today, we take the next step because the ICC continues to target Americans, sadly.
The Trump administration has repeatedly attacked the International Criminal Court for investigating war crimes committed by U.S. troops in Afghanistan, as well as Israeli crimes in the occupied territories. Human rights and legal groups criticize the Trump administration's move. Catherine Gallagher is a lawyer at the Center for Constitutional Rights. She represents victims of both U.S. and Israeli war crimes.
The sanctions announced by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo against Fatou Bensouda, the prosecutor of the ICC, constitutes a frontal attack on the rule of law. This action shows that the Trump administration is happy to stand with dictators and war criminals rather than with victims of war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity.
Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden's heading to Kenosha, Wisconsin today to meet with the family of Jacob Blake. The black man left paralyzed after being shot 7 times in the back at point-blank range by a Kenosha police officer. Trump visited Kenosha Wednesday but never said Jacob Blake's name. He visited on Tuesday. Meanwhile, President Trump campaign's press secretary appeared to justify the recent fatal shooting of 2 protesters in Kenosha by a white 17-year-old Trump-supporting vigilante. Hogan Gidley appeared on CNN.
The problem is so many Democrat governors, so many Democrat mayors have now said, don't do your job, stand down, let these riots, let these looters continue to criminalize our communities. And the president doesn't want that. He wants them to be able to stand up. But it does make sense, just logically. If you don't allow police to do their job, then the American people have to defend themselves some way.
President Trump's ordered federal officials to find ways to cut billions of dollars in federal funding to Democratic-run cities that have moved to reduce funding for the police. In a memo released Wednesday, Trump said, quote, it's imperative the federal government review the use of federal funds by jurisdictions that permit anarchy, violence, and destruction in American cities. The memo lists several cities, including Portland, Oregon, Washington, D.C., Seattle, and New York. It also directs the Justice Department to compile a list of what it calls, quote, anarchist jurisdictions. The mayor's office in New York decried Trump's move, saying, quote, this is a racist campaign stunt out of the Oval Office to attack millions of people of color. A warning to our audience, the following 3 stories contain disturbing images and descriptions of police violence. Shocking new details have emerged about the police killing of a black man named Daniel Prude in Rochester, New York in March. Video released by his family shows Prude died from asphyxiation after officers handcuffed him, put a hood over his head, then pushed his face into the freezing cold ground for 2 minutes while kneeling on his back. Daniel Prude was naked and unarmed. He died 7 days later. The police encounter began when Prude's brother called 911 asking for help because his brother was acting strangely. On Wednesday, 3 Black Lives Matter activists were arrested during a protest. Prude's family is calling for the firing of the officers involved in the defunding of the Rochester Police Department. In news from California, a police officer in San Leandro has been charged with felony manslaughter after shooting dead a 33-year-old black man named Stephen Taylor inside a Walmart April 18th. Within a span of 40 seconds, Officer Jason Fletcher entered Walmart, shot Taylor with a taser, and then shot him in the chest with his gun. In a statement, the Alameda County District Attorney stated, quote, Mr. Taylor posed no threat of imminent deadly force or serious bodily injury to defendant Fletcher or anyone else in the store, unquote. Police were first called to the Walmart because Taylor was trying to leave the store with a tent and a bat. His family said he was homeless at the time. The family of a Salvadoran-American teenager shot dead in June has sued the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department over his killing. 18-year-old Andres Guardado died after being shot in the back 5 times. He was working as a security guard at an auto body shop when 2 officers approached him. One of his co-workers says Guardado became scared and started running away after an officer drew a gun. A whistleblower within the sheriff's department says the deputy who shot Guardado was a prospective member of a violent police gang within the department known as the Executioners. The whistleblower, Art Gonzalez, said earlier this summer, quote, members become inked as executioners after executing members of the public or otherwise committing acts of violence in furtherance of the gang, unquote. President Trump has suggested people in North Carolina break the law by voting twice in the upcoming presidential election, one by mail and then again in person, to test the election system.
Let them send it in and let them go vote. And if their system's as good as they say it is, then obviously they won't be able to vote. If it isn't tabulated, they'll be able to vote. So that's the way it is. And that's what they should do.
Under federal law, voting twice is illegal. In North Carolina, it's also illegal to induce someone to vote twice. Meanwhile, the Republican National Committee and the Trump campaign have sued the state of Montana to block an expansion of mail-in voting. In other election news, Lara Trump, the president's senior campaign advisor and daughter-in-law, campaigned in Florida Wednesday with Laura Loomer, a far-right congressional candidate and conspiracy theorist. Loomer is a self-described proud Islamophobe who's called Muslims savages and Islam a cancer. She once cheered on the death of migrants crossing the Mediterranean. Loomer has been banned from Facebook and Twitter for promoting hate on platforms. Loomer is the Republican nominee in Florida's 21st congressional district, which includes Mar-a-Lago, the president's private club. A federal appeals court has ruled the National Security Agency's bulk collection of Americans' phone records is illegal. The program was exposed by NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden in 2013. Snowden tweeted Wednesday, quote, "The ruling of the court demolishes the longest-held defenses of mass surveillance. After taking into account the best of the government's evidence, the court found the program unlawful and ineffective, establishing the government's public claims of necessity were deceitful," Snowden said. German authorities say they have confirmed Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was poisoned last month by a military-grade nerve agent originally developed by the Soviet Union. Alexei Navalny was airlifted to a hospital in Germany 2 days after he became violently ill aboard a flight from Siberia to Moscow. He remains in a coma. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said, quote, "There are very serious questions now that only the Russian government can answer and must answer." We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast. In France, the trial's begun of over a dozen people accused of being accomplices in a series of attacks that killed 17 people in and around Paris over 3 days in January 2015. The attacks began when 2 French-Algerian brothers stormed the offices of the satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo, killing 11 people at the paper. On the following day, another gunman killed 4 Jewish men at a kosher supermarket. All 3 of the main suspects were killed. Charlie Hebdo was targeted because of its history printing caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad. Ahead of the trial, the newspaper reprinted a number of the cartoons. 44 members of Congress, as well as Amnesty International and other groups, are urging the Trump administration to block the imminent deportation of a Ugandan pastor, saying he'll likely be killed if sent back home. Pastor Stephen Tendo fled Uganda and sought asylum in the United States in 2018 after being tortured and arrested dozens of times in Uganda for supporting political prisoners and voting rights. During one torture session, 2 of his fingers were cut off. Tendo's been jailed for over 18 months while seeking asylum in the United States. In Oklahoma, a 105-year-old woman is leading a lawsuit demanding reparations for one of the worst massacres of African Americans in U.S. history. In June 1921, a white mob burned to the ground Tulsa's affluent African-American neighborhood of Greenwood, known as Black Wall Street, killing at least 300 residents. Leslie Benningfield Randall is one of 2 known living survivors of the massacre. The lawsuit says the aftermath of the massacre is still felt by the community as racial inequality in Tulsa can be traced back to the massacre nearly a century later. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I am Amy Goodman here in New York City, joined by my co-host Nermeen Shaikh. Welcome, Nermeen.
Good morning, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
Well, we begin today's show in Texas, where Fort Hood's top commander's been removed from his post as public outcry grows over a series of killings and accusations of sexual abuse at the Army base. There have been 23 deaths at Fort Hood this year alone. 13 soldiers have been disappeared or killed or died by suicide. Last week, the remains of another Fort Hood soldier, Elder Fernandez, were found near the base hanging from a tree. On Tuesday, the Army announced a new investigation into Fort Hood's chain of command related to the April murder of soldier Vanessa Guillen, whose remains were found near the base at the end of June. In July, her family announced the remains had been found at a news conference in Washington, D.C., where they demanded a congressional investigation into Vanessa's case. This is Lupe Guillen, Vanessa Guillen's younger sister, speaking that day in D.C.
My sister, Vanessa Guillen, was sexually harassed They didn't keep my sister safe. They always try to cover up for each other. Why? My sister's a human too. She deserves respect. She deserves to be heard. Because if this can happen to my sister, it can happen to anyone else. How can this happen on military base? How can this happen while she was on duty? They don't care about us. My sister's an example of it. My sister did not deserve to suffer.
Okay.
My sister did not deserve this.
Link. The main suspect in Vanessa Guillen's death, another Fort Hood soldier, Specialist Aaron David Robinson, died by suicide, according to the police, as they approached him in July, shortly after he was accused. A federal complaint alleges Robinson killed Guillen with a hammer on Fort Hood before removing her body in a box. He and his girlfriend then allegedly dismembered the remains. Robinson shot himself as police approached him. According to her family, Vanessa Guillen had been planning on reporting Robinson for sexual harassment. Her case has sparked national outrage about sexual assault in the military. In July, her family met with President Trump and also announced legislation to create a third-party agency where active military personnel can report sexual assault and harassment outside their chain of command. The bill is named I Am Vanessa Guillen. Guillen was just 20 years old when she was killed. For more on the latest developments at Fort Hood, we go to Charleston, South Carolina, where we're joined by Pam Campos-Palma, political strategist with Working Families Party, where she leads the Vets for the People project. She's an Air Force veteran. We welcome you to Democracy Now!, Pam. It's great to have you with us. You're deeply involved with this case. Can you talk about the latest developments this week, the commander of Fort Hood being forced to step down, and how it ties into the Vanessa Guillen case, all that you know about her case so far?
Sure. It's been a devastating time. I mean, many of us, survivors, veterans, supporters of the Guillen family, and all those that have been lost at Fort Hood have been organizing for months since her disappearance to her murder. And the recent developments from the Army in terms of leadership change at Fort Hood is a hopeful sign of the hard work of activists who have really demanded true accountability and no more piecemeal reforms. However, it's not enough. We've been very clear that the Army can no longer continue to investigate itself. Even with this acting commander, Scott Efland, he's still staying on the base. It's not clear if he will actually pay with his career for the gross criminal negligence under his watch. And he's also not the only commander, right? This is not unique to Vanessa Guillen. This is not unique to Fort Hood. Rampant military sexual violence, corruption, impunity has been a decades-long issue that can no longer be ignored.
Pam, you say that what's happened at Fort Hood is not exceptional. Nevertheless, the sheer rate of violent crime on the base is extraordinary. As we mentioned, the number of people who've died by suicide, who've been killed or simply disappeared. Can you say something about the way in which this military base in particular is run, its chain of command, its leadership, and why you think there have been so many incidents this year alone?
Right. It is exceptional what is happening at Fort Hood. However, criminality, violent crime at Fort Hood has been happening for years. For the last 11 years, in fact, Fort Hood has had among the highest rates of sexual assault, suicide, a mass shooting, and now multiple human trafficking rings, which involved active duty Fort Hood soldiers. What's really interesting about Fort Hood as well is that it is also one of the largest military installations in the world, and also produces some of the highest ranking, most notable names in the military, right? Our current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley himself, before being the highest ranking officer currently in the armed forces, was a commander at Fort Hood, and others who are now pundits and known household military general names also commanded at Fort Hood. And so my point is that rape culture, systemic racism, corruption and impunity has been really part and parcel in the Department of Defense for decades. And part of this problem has been not just there's a couple of pieces to this problem. One is if rape and racism are not really deemed the problem, but part of the culture, it's impossible to report. And the current reporting systems in place and mechanisms are dissuasive. By the Army's own account, in these cases, in these past few months, it's been even more exposed how retaliation within the ranks for reporting is a problem. Secondarily, where is the accountability? Consistently, Congress has not necessarily stepped up to their responsibility of true oversight of the military. Congress is really the only ones that can hold the Department of Defense accountable. And time again, they have relied on the military to investigate themselves.
I remember the news conference so well in Washington, the family driving from Texas to Washington, D.C. And the news conference was delayed in the hot sun because the family was just getting word that the military said they had found the remains of Vanessa Guillen. Now, they had been calling for this investigation for months. Clearly, the pressure being brought as the family actually made it to D.C. and were demanding that a bill be passed in Vanessa Guillen's name, calling for an independent way for people to come forward. Can you explain the significance of this bill, Pam?
Sure. I mean, it is imperative. Decades of commanders, the choice has been really clear in the military. Protect the careers of longtime generals and high-ranking officers, or protect everyday soldiers. And time again, they've chosen to protect commanders. And commanders have not actually expunged sexual violence from the ranks. In fact, it has risen. And so it is extremely important for there to be an independent way for folks in the military to report instances of harassment, of assault, of hate crimes. However, it is not the only thing. One of the most important things that is not to be lost is for too long, rape, violence in the military has been treated as an occupational hazard. And so while the bill, which is not yet drafted, the I Am Vanessa Guillen bill is not yet drafted, there are other more comprehensive bills going through the Hill, it does take one part of the problem, which is an independent third party is a positive step. However, there needs to be a complete overhaul of military culture where sexual assault is not a training tool, where it is not permissible, and where there's actual accountability. The fact that little to no officers are ever really held with account and do not pay with their careers, are allowed to continue to retire, shows you that this is permissible within the ranks.
Gloria Guillen, Vanessa's mother, met with President Trump at the White House in July. She spoke to Trump via a Spanish-English interpreter. However, 10 minutes into the conversation, the translator stopped interpreting after Vanessa's mother, Gloria, made a request of Trump. This was first reported in the podcast In the Thick with Maria Hinojosa. Let's go ahead with the translation that we did.
My daughter's story is now history. My daughter's story is the story of the whole nation, of the whole world. I've dreamed of my daughter many times, and she tells me to save the children. To save the children. I don't know which children she speaks of, but I want you to help me. I don't know if it's the children on the border, but if she tells me to save the children, I want you to help me with the children. She is history now, and you can be part of that history if you help by doing something good for this nation.
That's Gloria Guillen, Vanessa's mother, saying to President Trump, dreaming of her daughter, telling her to be concerned about the children. She wasn't sure if they were children on the border. The significance of this, and as we end, Pam, what the latest found with Elder Fernandez's remains and the charges that he, too, was being sexually harassed. They say he took his own life.
Yeah. I can't repeat it enough. Gloria Guillen has been one of the most clear, and one of the biggest failings in this whole process is she doesn't speak English, right? And so, but she has been very clear in her pursuit. And one of the things that has made these cases different and has shed a greater light has been a working class immigrant woman, immigrant families who are not playing into the blind adulation of military generals and just blindly trusting them and saying, we demand accountability. Gloria Guillen was brave to not only tell the president, to tell Congress, to tell military top brass, shut down Fort Hood. It is not a good for anyone. And I think in this moment, we are in an inflection point in this nation where everyday Americans are questioning the institutions that continue to fail us. She has also said, if there is no justice for these dead soldiers, then we will not, in good conscience, continue to promote enlistment of our young people, particularly when Black and brown people are among the highest rates of enlistment. And so whether it's Kenosha, Wisconsin, and the systemic failures by police, who also like to investigate themselves, to the military's continued failings, treating everyday soldiers like government property, throwing us into endless wars with no real questions or strategy. This is now the time to divest from violence and invest in real solutions that treat us in our full humanity. And so I was not surprised to see an immigrant, Gloria Guillen, making these demands in a time where our country is really grappling with what safety for who, defense for who is protected. And we will continue to organize for Vanessa Guillen, Elder Fernandez, and for true accountability from the Department of Defense and Congress.
We want to thank you so much for being with us, Pam Campos Palma, political strategist with Working Families Party. She herself, an Air Force military intelligence vet, head of Vets for the People Project. Next, we go to Belarus, where mass protests continue to demand the resignation of President Alexander Lukashenko amidst a brutal government crackdown. Stay with us.
¿Y dónde está Vanessa? Es la pregunta que se le hizo al gobierno y no nos dan respuesta. ¿Será porque nos están escondiendo algo o no les interesa? Pues como la víctima es de piel morena, a ellos en nada les afecta. Tratan de deportarnos cuando estas tierras fueron nuestras y aún así las seguimos trabajando. Como animales a nuestros niños en jaulas los tienen encerrados, sin corazón destruyendo a nuestras familias, tratando de separarnos. Esto tiene que cambiar, tenemos que despertar.
We Demand Equality by Yariel Roaro in honor of Vanessa Guillen. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Mimi Goodman with Nermeen Shaikh. We turn now to Belarus, where people marched and sang in Minsk on Wednesday during ongoing protests of thousands against Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko. Protests and strikes against the authoritarian ruler, Alexander Lukashenko, have continued for weeks since he claimed victory in the presidential election on August 9th. Critics say his victory was rigged, but he shows no sign of backing down. Lukashenko has ruled for 26 years. The states responded to ongoing protests with violence and repression. Mass police dragged student protesters into police vans Tuesday after thousands flooded the streets of Minsk. Authorities have also arrested at least 3 factory strike leaders in recent weeks. This comes amidst a crackdown on the the media in Belarus. 2 former TV hosts were arrested in Minsk Wednesday. At least 19 journalists who work for foreign media outlets have had their accreditation revoked, and 2 Associated Press reporters have been deported. Well, for more, we go to London, where we're joined by Sadakat Kadri, a human rights lawyer and writer with a focus on Eastern Europe. His recent piece on Belarus for the London Review of Books is headlined, "The Revolution Will Not Be Colorized." Welcome to Democracy Now!, Sadakat Kadri. If you can just start off by laying out the scene and the situation in Belarus since that election, August 9th. Talk about who ran in that election and what's happened since. Hundreds and hundreds of people have been imprisoned.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's the 6th election that Lukashenko has won. He's been in power now for 26 years, as you said. It's the 6th election. It's the 6th landslide. He's never won less than 77% of the vote. He won 80.1% this time round. It was kind of expected in the sense that he's been rigging elections for a very long time. But also what was expected is that people would not really react as they have, because what happened is that there were protests, as there have been protests in all the other landslides that he's won. But then he came out, his riot police came out. They rounded up more than 7,000 people over the next few days. There were allegations of torture, allegations of attempted rape. I think the difference this time around is simply that people have been using social media, not just Facebook, but also the social media channel Telegram. So the allegations of torture, the images of torture went viral. The demonstrations kept going on. They didn't peter out as people kind of expected they would after a couple of days. They lasted for days, then weeks, and then the bedrock of Lukashenko's support over the last few years, factory workers, they came out on strike. Leading figures in Belarusian society, heads of the National Orchestra, the National Theatre, the rector of the National University, came out again in support of the demonstrators, to the extent that after a week, Lukashenko's interior minister effectively apologized on national TV, said that many of the wrong people had been arrested, which is unheard of in Belarusian history. And for about a week, there was a kind of stalemate. There still is a kind of stalemate. But what that means is that demonstrators are coming out every weekend. As you said, since the university started again this week, students have been coming out. And Lukashenko doesn't really seem to know exactly what to do, because, of course, he could try and crush the demonstrators. But I think he realizes that all bets will be off if he uses serious force against the demonstrators, more serious force than he's already used. He's been photographed in the last couple of weeks, both last weekend and this weekend, once with an assault rifle in his hand and once with a machine gun in his hand. So he clearly wants the protesters and the world to think that they need to take him seriously. But whether or not he's going to actually get his security forces to use live fire and to use more force than they already have, it's all up in the air at the moment. I mean, there's everything to play for here.
And Sadakat, as we mentioned in the introduction, there's been a massive crackdown on any kind of independent reporting on what's going on. And you wrote in your London Review of Books piece, "The Revolution Will Not Be Colorized," you wrote, quote, "Belarusian state media, meanwhile, are pumping out alarmist propaganda similar to that seen in Russia before the invasion of Crimea, tales of fascism on the march, and fantastically untrue claims that the Russian language is about to be sidelined." So could you say more about how these protests are being covered in the media there, and how people are communicating through social media or other means to keep these protests going despite this massively brutal response by Lukashenko's government?
Sure. Well, I mean, the reason that my article was called "The Revolution Will Not Be Colorized" is because there's a narrative in Russia about what's called the color revolutions. It's named after the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2004, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2005. In the West, we tend to think of these as being popular revolutions where people are angry with rigged votes. But in Russia, they're seen as something very different. They're seen as a deliberate strategy by the West to basically promote discontent to overthrow governments which, according to the Moscow narrative, legitimate governments. I mean, they're governments after very contested elections, like this 80% majority that Lukashenko just claims to have won now. And so, in the eyes of Putin, of people from Vladimir Putin downwards, President Putin of Russia downwards, the one thing they need to avoid is another revolution like the thing that happened in Ukraine in 2014, a color revolution. I should say in that context, I mean, I've been talking to quite a few Belarusians. They're very nervous themselves about being linked too closely to the Ukraine example specifically. They don't want to be thought of as being a color revolution, as being a Maidan kind of revolution, like as was seen in Ukraine in 2014. They're even nervous about being associated with the European Union. In the Ukraine, you saw a lot of European Union flags being flown at all the demonstrations. That's not happening at all in Belarus at the moment. They're saying we are simply fighting for our rights. We're fighting for the election to be rerun and to be rerun fairly. And we're confident that if it is rerun fairly, then Lukashenko will lose power. On the question of social media that you raised, it is very much a social media revolution. The Arab Spring was famously called a Twitter revolution. I suppose Facebook has been the channel that's been used more often in Central and Eastern Europe over the last few years. But it's a specific social media channel called Telegram, which is making the running in Belarus at the moment. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of people are getting daily updates. I mean, there are hundreds of updates every day with videos, with images, telling people where to march, because it's a cat and mouse game at the moment in Belarus. The riot police are back out on the streets after this, after being pulled in the first week, but they aren't. They aren't directly confronting the demonstrators, and the demonstrators aren't directly confronting them either. If you look on the Telegram channels, you'll actually see instructions, real-time instructions to demonstrators to turn left on this street and to turn right on that street in order to avoid confrontations with the police. And of course, the censorship just doesn't work anymore. I mean, you've got Lukashenko has done his best to make up for the fact that a lot of the presenters on state TV have resigned by bringing in help from Russia, help in inverted commas. Basically, the broadcasters from RT, the channel that used to be known as Russia Today, have flown in. 2 teams of them came in last week, I think, and one of them is still in Belarus, and they're basically keeping the state media running. But no one believes it. People are relying for their information, of course, on foreign media channels, but also just on social media and on Telegram in particular.
Sadaka, could you talk a little bit more about Putin's relationship with Lukashenko, and also what status Belarus has as a former Soviet republic with Russia? Putin has said that he could send in police forces into Belarus. What is at stake for Russia in these protests? What kind of support have these protests received among civil society in Russia?
Sure. Well, everything's at stake. Everything's at stake for everyone in Russia. I mean, for Putin, he can't afford to see Belarus fall, in inverted commas. The Ukraine has been lost in his eyes to the West already, or to Europe already. He can't afford to see another former member of the Soviet Union fall. And I'm using inverted commas with that. But the position's slightly complicated by the fact that even though he and Lukashenko see eye to eye on that, neither of them want to see, least of all Lukashenko, want to see Lukashenko's government fall. But Lukashenko and Putin are not friends. Lukashenko's been in power for 26 years. Putin's only been in power for 20 years. As far as Lukashenko is concerned, this guy's just an upstart. He's got the 2 countries are theoretically in a union. No one quite knows what the union means because the Pact of Union was signed in the 1990s. But it was signed at a time when Lukashenko thought that he would be the senior partner in the union because his real partner was Boris Yeltsin. And I don't know if you remember, but Boris Yeltsin at that point was not should we say, in command of all his faculties. He was an elderly drunkard by that point. And Lukashenko thought that he was going to be running the show in years to come. Then Putin comes along, and we all know what's happened, how Vladimir Putin has improved his fortunes over the last 20 years. And Lukashenko's reaction has been to make overtures to both the European Union and also to the United States. As your listeners, your viewers may or may not know, Mike Pompeo made a visit to Minsk just in February of this year. It was the first visit by an American Secretary of State for 25 years. And obviously the relations between the White House and the Kremlin are complicated, shall we say, at the moment. And, but Lukashenko is Lukashenko imagined that he was playing everyone off against each other. He can't afford to do that anymore. The game may be up for him. So he's basically turning towards Putin. Putin can't afford to let Lukashenko fall either. So he's leaning towards towards Lukashenko as well. And then in terms of civil society, you asked. I mean, opponents of Vladimir Putin, critics of Vladimir Putin, are looking very carefully at what's going on in Belarus at the moment. And one of the people who's looking most carefully is, in fact, Alexei Navalny, the vlogger, video blogger, who has just been allegedly poisoned by Vladimir Putin. About a week after the election, he devoted one of his YouTube broadcasts, which regularly attract more than several million viewers. He devoted that broadcast to the strike movement in Belarus and told Russians how effective it was at holding leaders to account. Now, that's not the kind of message that the Kremlin wants to hear, but it is an inspiring message for the people who are tackling corruption within Russia.
And very quickly, if you could tell us about Navalny right now, who's in a coma in Germany. Talk about the German doctor's findings. He was apparently poisoned, perhaps at the airport in Siberia or on the flight. Tell us the drug that the Germans believe was used and the significance of his position in Russia. And then the fact that the opposition leader in Belarus, who's now, I believe, in Lithuania, she will be addressing the UN tomorrow.
Right. Yeah. Well, I should start by saying that the Russians who examined Navalny said that there were no toxins present at all, that it was just a case of low blood sugar levels, and that was that. Then he was flown to Germany. As you say, Angela Merkel yesterday held a press conference where she said that beyond any doubt he'd been poisoned. It was a very serious matter, and Russia needed to answer questions. Her spokesman had previously said that the poison that was found was a nerve agent of the Novichok variety. Now, the reason that that's significant is because Novichok came into the news. We all know about Novichok because 2 years ago, a Russian former operative of the secret services living here in the UK, in a town called Salisbury, was allegedly poisoned by two members of the GRU, of the security services in Russia, and they used that poison. Traces of that poison, Novichok, were found. It's a very deadly poison. It's been placed on the list of prohibited substances under the Chemical Warfare Convention. The reason it's significant is because Navalny had a lot of enemies. There were lots of people who had reasons to poison Navalny. But Novichok is not the kind of thing that you get by popping down to the local drugstore. Novichok is something which is produced only in state laboratories, as far as anyone knows, in any event. And in any case, it's not the kind of thing that should be running loose in Russia. If Russia was serious, if Putin's Russia was serious about getting to the bottom of this thing, because they say that they have nothing to do with it, of course. If they were serious about that, then they would be conducting an absolutely thorough investigation now, because it's the idea that a weapon banned by the Chemical Warfare Convention is available to ordinary people in Russia is flabbergasting. And if that is the case, Vladimir Putin should be getting on top of this now.
And finally, the Belarus opposition leader, what she will be telling the UN and her significance having left Belarus.
Well, I mean, Svetlana Tikhonovskaya she's the wife of another very popular vlogger in Belarus, the kind of an equivalent of Alexei Navalny in Belarus. She's very new to this game. She's not a politician. She stood in because her husband's candidacy was ruled out back in May or June. He was prohibited. He was jailed on trumped-up charges, and he was prohibited from running for president himself. So she stepped up to the plate. She campaigned very effectively, huge rallies. Supposedly won just 10% of the election of the vote, which of course is highly contested and almost certainly ridiculous. What she'll be saying to the United Nations, I'm sure, is that the pressure needs to be kept up on Lukashenko and that the election should be rerun.
Sadakat Kadri, I want to thank you so much for being with us, human rights lawyer, writer. We'll link to your piece in the London Review of Books, The Revolution Will Not Be Colorized. When we come back, Joe Biden is going to Kenosha today, following Trump's visit on Tuesday. He'll be meeting with the Blake family. Stay with us. We'll be speaking with a Congress member who grew up in Kenosha. Stay with us.
Divide. Divide. And conquer. A loved one perished at the hands of the barren high-tyrants. A loved one perished at the hands of the barren high-tyrants. A loved one perished at the hands of the barren high-tyrants. Divide.
Divide and Conquer by Idols. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Shaikh. Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden heads to Kenosha, Wisconsin today to meet with the family of Jacob Blake, the African-American man left paralyzed after being shot 7 times at point-blank range in the back by a Kenosha police officer last month, setting off ongoing protests. This comes 2 days after President Trump visited Kenosha, where he met primarily with law enforcement, never said Jacob Blake's name. Meanwhile, Trump campaign's press secretary, Hogan Gidley, appeared to justify the recent fatal shooting of 2 protesters in Kenosha by a white 17-year-old Trump-supporting vigilante named Kyle Rittenhouse. For more, we're joined by Congressmember Mark Pocan of Wisconsin. He was born and raised in Kenosha. His family friends with one of the victims, the Black Lives Matter victims, shot to death during the protests. We thank you so much for being with us. Mark Pocan is co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and also the LGBTQ Equality Caucus, joining us from Madison, Wisconsin, where he lives with his husband. We welcome you to Democracy Now!, Congressmember Pocan. Well, can you start off by talking about the significance of Trump's visit? Even the local businessman whose burned out business he stood in front of would not meet with him, refused a photo op, said he turns everything into a circus. But can you talk about the killing of the 2 protesters, one of whom you know, Anthony Huber, you know his family, and the police shooting of Jacob Blake, what you want to see done?
Yeah, and thanks so much for having me. And, you know, that's the part that was completely ignored by the president's visit, and which is why I think the governor and the mayor didn't want the president to come just to fan the flames. You know, clearly what happened, someone shot in the back 7 times, close range in front of their children by the police, was another example of the policing problem we have in this country. And then the protests and some of the violence that came out after that, when the vigilantes came from out of state and out of Kenosha, and in fact, I think the vast majority of people who were arrested were from outside of Kenosha. So outside agitators came in, including Kyle Rittenhouse, with walking down the road with a rifle, given water by the police, not stopped as he's walking down the road with a rifle. And then he shot 2 people, including Anthony Huber, who was the grandson of my mother's best friend. when those things happened, that's what you respond to. And of course, Donald Trump came to say attaboy to the local law enforcement when that's not even close to the message that came out of what happened in Kenosha. So, we were very concerned when the president came because, clearly all he cares about is himself, not Kenosha. We wish he would have cared about Kenosha when he came, but he had no messages of unity or reconciliation. And that's what we're really hoping for today from Joe Biden.
Well, Representative Pocan, it's not just Trump's visit that has been opposed, but even Joe Biden's, which the mayor of Kenosha has said in both cases that it's too early for them to come. Could you talk about the significance of Wisconsin as a critical state in the upcoming elections? In 2016, of course, Trump won by just a narrow margin in Wisconsin.
Yeah. Well, we're a purple state. We can vote Democratic or Republican statewide. We have really deep blue pockets and really deep red pockets. But in 2016, we had a 200 to 250,000 Democratic voter drop-off. So, that won't happen again. In 2018, we took every constitutional office in Wisconsin by 1 point, but they became Democratic. So, we figured out the voting issue that we had in 2016 by a candidate at the time who never came to Wisconsin and didn't put many resources here. That's not the case with Joe Biden. And I was in Kenosha Tuesday visiting my 91-year-old mother when Donald Trump came. And I can tell you, this is one where, I think the mayor is trying to keep consistent with a message, but there is healing going on. And Jacob Blake's family wants to meet with Joe Biden. And that's part of the healing that needs to happen. And I understand politicians want to be consistent rather than correct when they say people shouldn't come. But the healing does need to continue. I was rather shocked by seeing almost 3/4 of the businesses boarded up, even in areas where no violence happened, because people are nervous. People in Kenosha are good people, and this is something that they don't expect to happen in their hometown, especially with outside vigilantes roaming the streets. And, I think this is what needs to happen today. If Joe Biden says today what he said on Monday, that's exactly the message of unity Kenosha needs.
President Trump has defended Kyle Rittenhouse. He is a 17-year-old carrying an AR-15 automatic weapon, a long gun. This is illegal in Wisconsin. He wasn't even arrested as he put his hands up and walked over to the police, had been talking with them earlier as he slung his gun in front of him. He turned himself in.
That's the policing problem that I'm talking about. And for the president to ignore that, instead come and thank the law enforcement, we have to adjust policing in this country. And we passed a major bill in the House to try to do that. But the fact that a law enforcement officer, even after what happened in Minneapolis, even after what's happened by all the debate across the country, to close range 7 shots in someone's back in front of their children, that just shows we need to seriously reform how we do policing. I've been an advocate for having consistent training across the country. We don't have that right now. I think that's necessary. There's a lot of other things that we put in that bill that are necessary. But for Donald Trump to ignore that and to actually kind of encourage outsiders to come into communities. This is all because Donald Trump is trying to last grasp at a message for his campaign of law and order, when all he has done is create chaos and disorder, whether it be around the coronavirus. We have no national plan. We still don't have testing supplies and PPE equipment in Wisconsin, for example. We've had 100,000 small businesses closed down because of how COVID has been dealt with. And we have racial tensions because of Donald Trump fanning the flames of hatred for many of his supporters. So it's that chaos. It's Donald Trump's America that's the problem. And at the Republican convention, they kept trying to say it's Joe Biden's America. I remember Joe Biden's America. When Barack Obama and Joe Biden were there, we didn't have these problems. This is Donald Trump's it's on his hands what's happening, and he's trying to have a new narrative that's not working.
During an interview on CNN yesterday, the U.S. Attorney General William Barr stood by his assertion. This is switching the topic, though he was with President Trump in Kenosha, but started talking about mail-in voting and said that it can be fraudulent. He was much more strong about it.
This is playing with fire. This is playing with fire. We're a very closely divided country here. And if people have to have confidence in the results of the election and the legitimacy of the government, and people trying to change the rules to this methodology, which, as a matter of logic, is very open to fraud and coercion, is reckless and dangerous. And the people are playing with fire.
Playing with fire, Congressmember Pocan. And President Trump yesterday in North Carolina encouraging people to vote twice.
Yeah, I mean, these are all outright lies. They're trying to get ready for when they lose. They're looking at the polls as well. Donald Trump, with the post office, has tried to create chaos. He wants people to think that their ballot somehow won't count if they put it in the mail. He's trying to do everything he can to pick voters rather than voters picking the next president. And then he's trying to set up this case that there's somehow this fraudulent way of voting that he and his family and many cabinet members have themselves voted. Members of Congress often vote from home via mail because we're not available. So this is just an outright lie that he's putting out there, and he's trying to make a case of this, again, chaos and confusion that he's putting out there. And, you know, the reality is he's created the environment where people don't want to go and vote on Election Day because they don't want to get sick and get their family sick either. So this is Donald Trump's problem. He still won't address the problem that we have 187,000 deaths in this country because of the way he's mishandled COVID-19. And now he's trying to somehow put this onto voting when the only reason we even have a large amount of people wanting to vote from home is because of COVID-19.
Well, on another issue regarding the elections, you recently tweeted a letter that you wrote and had 18 other Democratic members of Congress sign into, expressing concern that the Office of the Director of National Intelligence has refused in-person briefings to Congress about foreign interference in the upcoming elections. So if you could talk about that letter, and also the proposal you recently put forth to cut the Pentagon budget by 10% so that money could be freed to fight COVID-19 in the state and the country. Sure.
Well, thank you. On the first one, you know, this is a letter that we sent because the one power we do have as Congress is the power of the purse. And if some agency is going to listen to the president and not do their responsibility by keeping Congress informed, we can stop their budget, and we should stop their budget and not fund them if they're going to allow the president to manipulate an agency. So that's what we were asking for, and I think it's something we should do. And in this month, we have to actually, our fiscal year ends September 30th, we have to deal with this. So I'm hoping that this is something we can make very real unless they do the right thing and brief Congress. On the Pentagon budget, you know, this is something that I've watched in the last 4 years. We have increased defense spending 20% at a time of relative peace. There's no excuse for that. And when you look at the cost overruns and the abuse and the fraud, almost every major contractor has been charged with fraud. And yet, you know, we continue to put now, you know, $740 billion a year into this. We need to start cutting back. And, you know, 10% is a pretty modest cut for them to do. We said not from the troops or their health care, but from all the other things, the private contractors, et cetera, that we could do. And we were, fortunately, we got over 90 votes for a 10% cut. And only 3 years ago, Barbara Lee and I did this. Barbara Lee, at the time, had introduced a 1% cut and only got 70-some members. So we increased the number of members by 20 by increasing the cut 10%. And also the sequester that's kind of held non-defense spending and defense spending kind of in line. If you increased one, the other increased. So if you wanted money for education or schools, you had to increase defense spending. That ends as of this year. So next year, we have a real opportunity to go in and make some serious cuts on defense so we can trim it and right-size it. And that's going to be a major goal of many of us in Congress.
And last 10 seconds. Richard Neal just prepared, chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, over Alex Morse in Western Mass. It was described as a fiercely homophobic campaign. Your thoughts?
It was, you know, whoever in their party, the Massachusetts party, convinced college Democrats to try to do a smear campaign should be kicked out of office. There's no accounting for that in politics. There shouldn't be for either party, and certainly Democrats should have a higher standard.
Congressman Mark Pocan, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Shaikh. Stay safe.